Surveys consistently show that retirees are, as a whole, more fearful of running out of money than of dying. And so as we think back to the history of how we solved this problem, a guy by the name of Bill Bengen came up with this idea of how much can I withdraw and still not run out of money? And he came up with the answer, 4%. Hence the 4% rule, which is what we're going to talk about today. Does it still hold up? Is it a good rule of thumb to think about for your financial plan?
So Spencer, one thing in life is going to be guaranteed. It's that we're all going to die. But as you alluded to, people are more afraid of running out of money than dying. So when we think about how can we encourage clients to take distributions, the 4% rule is one that we come back to pretty regularly because it does kind of give clients a baseline. Now, every person is unique. Every person is different. So we can't say the 4% rule is the rule to hold to and everybody should do it. It's absolutely not what we're saying. But I think it does give us a baseline for some conversation. So why don't you run us through what is the 4% rule? Give us a little bit of background on it.
Well, there's a financial advisor in the 1990s, Bill Bengen, who posed that question of how much can we withdraw over a normal retirement and not run out of money. So he came up with this idea that someone is going to retire in their mid-60s, let's say at 65, they're going to have a 30-year window for retirement. And he wanted to make sure that looking back on history, say the last 70 years of market history, that there would be a very, very high likelihood that that person would not run out of money if he or she took out a certain amount. And his research indicated that there'd be a high likelihood of success if they didn't take out more than 4.15%. Now, 4.15% is a mouthful, hence the 4% rule. And that's something that the financial media picked up and kind of ran with to say, okay, there's a simplicity here that we really like, that we think that people can latch onto if they don't take out more than 4%. Now, the reality is very few people retire at 65. Lots more people retire at other ages. The reality is that very few people need to be planning for 30 years. They're probably not going to live 30 years. They might live 34 years or 22 years or 17 years. But as a general idea, it again gained some traction within financial media as a rule of thumb that we could at least have a conversation about.
Yeah. I think some of those things that you bring up there, Spencer, are really crucial. First, not everybody's going to live for 30 years after they retire. So really, when we think about this 4% rule, it has to be flexible. Your financial plan has to be flexible. When things come up in your life, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, you've got to be flexible with your financial plan. So what are some of the other methodology? What's some of the underlying assumptions that Bengen had, aside from 30 years of retirement and retiring in that 60 years and then having that runway? What are some other things that we thought?
Well, he also included inflation, which is an important piece. So he looked back over that 70-year time frame and also looked at inflation, looked at a composition of a portfolio that was half in stocks and half in bonds, American stocks, American bonds to be specific. And he wanted to see, what periods would do to those investments if you had really low rates of return or high rates of return, low rates of inflation, high rates of inflation, and how all of that mix would work together in saying, did a portfolio stand up over time if I started at 4% as a withdrawal? So to kind of put an example here, let's say you had $1 million in an IRA and you started pulling out $40,000, 4% of that. Bengen's research would suggest that you would be, in most circumstances, in good shape if you started at that $40,000 and then you moved up a little bit each year with inflation over time. So the question of, well, how much can I start with? That's what Bengen was really getting after.
And I think the key piece here too is investors aren't always going to just take a flat 4%. If they see markets moving, then what we often see with our clients is they may not spend as much in a year. And so really, I think this is helpful to say, what is that starting place? Can I sustain this rate of return? Did it always work?
Well, not always. There are certainly circumstances where it wouldn't work, and we don't want to just look at the American experience and say that's all that's ever happened in human history. You think about what happened in Europe during World War II. You think about what happened in Japan. All kinds of different environments that wouldn't hold up over the last 100 years. But again, for US investors, stocks and bonds, 50-50, presuming that we're going to have some inflation to that, in almost all scenarios, it worked well. Again, we kind of go back to the 1970s with stagflation and some of the returns in there. And you would have to be quite careful if that was the starting point for your returns, because you have a downdraft and high inflation at the same time.
Right, right. What about taxes and fees? How is that included in the research?
It's not.
Okay.
So taxes and fees not included. You're basically just looking at that withdrawal rate. And to be fair, he's running this on a spreadsheet. He's looking at this and trying to say, what's a good rule of thumb that I start with here? This isn't meant to be exhaustive. This is meant to start a conversation. To your point, we have to come back and say, well, what does the data suggest an average retiree will do in terms of spending? Well, the research that's out there would suggest that they're not increasing spending at an inflationary level. Instead, their spending tends to be fairly flat if your average, and looking at some of the data from JP Morgan Chase and other providers that are out there. The other thing I think that we really have to grapple with is the fact that most folks are not going to have a 50-50 portfolio. They might have a little more in stocks. They might have a little less in stocks. They might have other types of investments. So we also need to pay attention to that piece. And the reality is that many of our clients, they're not going to have consistent spending over time. They might spend more the first 10 years. So they want to have an elevated level of spending because they want to take some trips. They want to make some gifts early on in retirement and see how those play out. And they may know that between their pension, Social Security, other kinds of income, that they have enough for that core spending over time, and that really what they've saved in large part can be used whenever they want to in retirement. So when we have a situation like that, we want to be open to a higher level of spending earlier, knowing that those core expenses are going to put less pressure on the plan later on.
Right. And so really the reality there is we have to think about this all in concert. We have to think about it in terms of, okay, when are you taking Social Security? When are you doing all these other pieces, especially if they're wanting to accelerate that initial level of withdrawal. Mm-hmm. So it may bump up a little bit higher, especially in those years pre-Social Security, if we're saying, hey, we want to defer Social Security. Mm-hmm. But again, this is a baseline of what research suggested for that time period. So what are maybe some different rules for different time horizons? How does a different time horizon really affect the 4% rule?
Well, if we have a longer time horizon, then we know that that 4% rule is going to come under additional strain. So let's think about it this way. Social Security Administration would suggest that about 1 in every 5 gentlemen is going to live to 95 or beyond. And something like 3 in every 10 women are going to do the same. So if you start retirement at 65 and you live past 95, then you're putting more pressure on that 4% rule, which isn't a ton of people, but 1 in 5, that's something that we need to plan for. 3 in 10, that's something that we need to plan for, men and women there. So we've got to really take into account that piece, in particular, that longevity piece, because we even see clients retiring in their late 50s or early 60s, and that elongates that time period even more because oftentimes people have worked really hard. They're in good health. They want to be able to have a great retirement. They might retire. They have the means in their late 50s. Okay, now we've got potentially 4 decades that we need to think about.
Right. Well, and as you take that Social Security life expectancy projections, what it doesn't often factor is that healthier, or people that often have higher levels of wealth, higher levels of education, they tend to live longer.
Right.
And so we can't say for certainty what that rate is, but we have to factor that into the equation, that if someone is retiring at 60, they have great health, they're educated, well, they may easily live into their late 80s. So really, we got to take it, again, holistically, comprehensively. We need to take every statistic with a grain of salt, knowing that our lives are dynamic. We're not static individuals.
We also want to acknowledge that there have been a few updates in research. Any good researcher is going to revisit the assumptions, the work that's been done, and Bengen has done that. What has been interesting about the way that he's processed that is that he recognizes that there are risks on a variety of different outcomes there, but also that if we have a higher allocation to stocks, it may support a higher level of distribution over time in most scenarios. He also recognizes that if we can have a variable spending pattern, that might be the best outcome overall, because it allows us to ratchet up the spending when the market is doing well, ratchet down the spending a little bit when the market isn't doing so well. But it allows us to have flexibility over a long period of time so that we don't run out of money, but we also don't leave too much on the table of that living and giving that maybe we would really like to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk through some of what you mean there by some sequence of timing. Mm-hmm. So let's talk through market volatility. What happens if the stock market drops pretty substantially right as I retire? How does that affect the 4% rule?
Well, and again, Bengen's research was in the early 1990s. So we hadn't encountered the period from 2000 to 2010 where we had basically a stock market that dropped substantially, recovered, dropped again, and was still underwater over 10 years. So in periods where we have a situation like that with still some inflation happening, we've got what's known as a sequence of returns risk. We've got to make sure that as we look at things, if we have downdrafts in the stock market and maybe we have low interest rates in the bond market, we may have an environment where we need to cut spending there and have that flexibility that he was really talking about. So high levels of inflation coupled with middling stock market returns or even low stock market returns like the 1970s can be hard on that, especially at the beginning of the distributions. Because if you think about it, if half of your portfolio is stocks and you're taking out 4% a year and you actually see a downdraft there for 10 years and maybe the bond market isn't great, doesn't give you a great rate of return, if your return is flat over 10 years, you've already exhausted 40% of your capital. So that's a really tough spot to put yourself in there at the outset, because no matter where you go after that first 10 years, you're going to struggle to keep up with distributions because the asset level is going to struggle to have enough gains to push out, the distributions that you're looking for over that inflation adjusted time frame.
Right. So thanks for walking us through that, Spencer. When we think about retirement planning for folks and we think about it within the context of their financial plan, how do we often approach this with our clients, the 4% rule?
Well, I often use it just in a sense of it's something that everybody has heard of, or many people have heard of at least. But I will often frame it if we have a client who is underspending or doing less living and giving than he or she may have capacity to do, we can do some simple math. So, for instance, recently had a client that had a couple $1 million of resources and was only planning to pull out $20,000 to $30,000 of resources over a significant period of time going forward. Well, the mental math is not all that difficult for folks that are in this space. We can say, okay, you're only pulling out maybe 1 or 2% here, but just even acknowledging that and saying, you're only pulling out about 1 or 2% of your portfolio here. Have you ever heard of the 4% rule? You're far, far south of that. Not to say that the 4% rule is inviolate or that that is what we're going to hold to. But as a rule of thumb, we can say, wow, you're far less than that. Let's make sure that as we put together your financial plan, that you feel the flexibility to be able to do some more living and giving there. So we never want to use the 4% rule as something that is going to be the primary marker that we're going to come back to and say, well, you're only pulling out 3.98%. You're in good shape. Yeah. That's not what we're saying. But we want to use it as one of those rules of thumb to say, well, good grief, given what you have, what you've saved, you're really not taking out maybe all that much. Or maybe we'll say you take out a significant amount, but then thereafter, after the first 5 years of retirement, you're well below, that 4% rule. So there's different ways that we can situate it in clients' minds that help them grasp the fact that they've got some flexibility, hopefully.
Well, Spencer, thanks for walking us through the 4% rule and the nuance that is therein. Clients, if you have questions about your retirement withdrawal strategies, feel free to reach out. We would love to talk with you about it at our next review. Hopefully you found value in this episode, and we will see you again next time. If you like these financial planning videos, please share it with a friend. And if you have questions, go to our website at SeriousRetirement.com. This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We are located in Knoxville, Tennessee. You can visit our website at SeriousRetirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only, and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents. Advisory services offered through Retirement Planning Services, LLC.